The soil between David's fingers crumbled differently here. He had spent 6 months cataloging plant life across Verdant 7, and nowhere else did the Earth feel quite like this. Dense, old, like it remembered things. He pressed his collection kit closed and marked another sample. The research outpost behind him was a small cluster of prefab buildings where 12 people lived and worked. 12 was too many for David. He had requested this posting specifically because the planet was remote, quiet, and mostly ignored by the rest of the galaxy. That a Kalar scientist named Orin approached from the main building. The Kalar were the native species here, tall and thin with skin that shimmered like oil on water. They had been helpful to the human research team, mostly because humans bothered to ask permission before setting up camp. "You go near the foothills again," Orin said. It was not a question. "Best specimens grow there," David replied, standing and brushing dirt from his knees. "We have asked you not to approach Silent Peak." David glanced at the mountain in the distance. It dominated the horizon, a massive formation of dark rock that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "I'm staying in the foothills, not climbing." Orin's three-fingered hand gestured something that might have been concern. The foothills are still her territory. No Kalar has gone there in generations. Her, the last dragon. She has lived on that mountain for 3,000 of your years, longer than our oldest records. Those who go near do not return, or they return changed. Frightened, we leave her alone. David had heard stories during his first week. Most of the human team dismissed them as local folklore, the kind of cautionary tales every culture developed about dangerous places. But the Kalar did not strike him as superstitious people. They were practical, scientific in their own way. "What does she want?" David asked. Orin made a sound like wind through hollow reeds. Kalar laughter. "Want? Nothing. She has not communicated with anyone in living memory. She simply exists, and we respect that existence by staying away." That night, David stood outside his small quarters and looked at the mountain. The twin moons cast strange shadows across its surface. For just a moment, he thought he saw something move. Something large, a shadow that did not match the moonlight. The next morning, David packed his field kit with 3 days of supplies. He told the outpost coordinator he was surveying the eastern valleys. It was not entirely a lie. The eastern valleys were near the foothills. Near the mountain, the walk took most of the day. Verdant 7 was beautiful in a way that made David's chest ache. Purple grasses that sang in the wind. Trees with silver bark that grew in perfect spirals. He had spent 2 years on crowded space stations before this, surrounded by recycled air and artificial lights. Here, he could breathe. The foothills began where the grasslands ended. Rocky ground, scattered boulders, and plants that grew low and tough. David set up his scanning equipment and began taking samples. Lichen that glowed faintly in shade. Moss that felt warm to the touch. He was so focused on his work that he did not notice the change in the air. The wind stopped. David looked up. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed at him to run. The dragon stood 50 meters away, partially hidden behind a boulder formation. She was larger than the transport ship that had brought him to this planet. Scales the color of old stone covered her body, each one the size of a dinner plate. Her wings were folded against her back, membranous and torn in places that suggested age and old battles. But her eyes were what made David freeze. They were not animal eyes. They held intelligence, sadness, and something that looked like curiosity. The protocol for encountering dangerous wildlife was clear. Make yourself small. Back away slowly. Do not make eye contact. David did none of these things. He sat down on the ground, crossed his legs, and went back to examining his moss sample. His hands shook. His heart hammered against his ribs. But he kept his head down and focused on his work because some deep part of him understood that running would be wrong. Not dangerous, just wrong. Minutes passed, maybe hours. David carefully placed the moss in a collection tube and labeled it. He took readings with his scanner. He made notes in his field journal, all while aware of the massive presence watching him. When he finally looked up again, the dragon had moved closer. Not threatening, just closer. She sat on her haunches like a cat, head tilted studying him with those ancient eyes. David nodded once. A small acknowledgement. Then he packed his equipment and walked back toward the outpost, moving slowly but not fearfully. The dragon watched him go. She did not follow. She did not call out or make any sound. But David felt her gaze on his back until he crossed out of the foothills and into the grasslands. That night, he did not tell anyone what he had seen. The team would want to investigate. They would bring equipment and protocols and excitement. They would ruin something that felt fragile and new. Instead, David lay in his bunk and thought about those eyes, about intelligence and loneliness, about being the last of your kind in a galaxy that had moved on without you. He understood that feeling better than he wanted to admit. 3 days later, he returned to the same spot in the foothills. The dragon was waiting. Week 3 of David's visits, and the dragon had started bringing things. The first gift appeared on a flat rock where he usually set up his equipment. A piece of crystal, perfectly clear, roughly the size of his fist. David picked it up and examined it in the sunlight. It split the light into dozens of colors. Beautiful and completely useless for his research. He looked around. The dragon sat on a ridge above him, partially hidden by the morning mist that clung to the mountain. He held up the crystal, nodded his thanks, and carefully placed it in his pack. That seemed to be the right response. The next day, there was a smooth black stone. The day after, a piece of petrified wood that must have been ancient even by dragon standards. David never asked for these things, never indicated he wanted them. But he accepted each one with the same simple nod, and he kept them all in a box under his bunk. The other researchers at the outpost had started to notice his frequent trips. Dr. Amira Walsh, the team leader, stopped him one morning as he prepared his field kit. "You are spending a lot of time in those foothills," she said. She was a good scientist and a better leader, which meant she noticed patterns. "Good specimens," David said. "The Kalars say that area is dangerous. I have been careful." Amira studied his face. She had worked with David long enough to know he preferred solitude, but this was different. "If you find something significant, you will report it?" Of course. It was not exactly a lie. The dragon was significant. But David knew that reporting her would change everything. The outpost would become a research station. Ships would arrive. Scientists would come with their questions and equipment and assumptions. The dragon would become a subject rather than a person. He had seen it happen before. During his first deep space assignment, they had discovered a species of bioluminescent creatures that communicated through light patterns. Beautiful, intelligent, unique. Within 6 months, they were in laboratories. Most died. The survivors were different, dimmer. David would not let that happen here. The dragon began appearing earlier in his visits. She would be waiting when he arrived, settled on her usual ridge or sometimes closer. Never threatening. Just present. One afternoon, David brought his lunch to the foothills. Dried fruit, protein bars, water. He sat on his usual rock and ate slowly, aware of the dragon watching. On impulse, he took out an extra protein bar and set on the ground between them. The dragon stared at it for a long moment. Then she moved, her massive body flowing like water despite its size. She picked up the bar delicately between 2 claws, examined it, and ate it in one bite. David tried not to laugh at the expression on her face. Dragons were not meant to eat human protein bars, but she had accepted it. That mattered more than taste. A routine developed. David would arrive mid-morning with his equipment. He would work for several hours, taking samples and notes. The dragon would watch. Sometimes she would move closer. Sometimes she would disappear for hours in return. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The Kalar elder named Tessa visited the outpost in the 5th week. She was ancient by Kalar standards. Her shimming skin faded to a dull gray. She asked to speak with David privately. They walked to the edge of the compound. Tessa moved slowly but with purpose. "The mountain is quieter," she said. David waited. "For 3,000 years, that place has felt angry. Old pain, old grief. Now it feels different, less sharp." She turned to look at him with eyes that had seen generations. "What are you doing in the foothills, human David?" He could have lied. Should have lied. Instead, he said, "Listening." Tessa made that wind through reeds sound again. "We tried everything when we were younger. offerings, songs, attempts at communication. She destroyed it all, killed those who came too close. So we learned to leave her alone. Maybe that is what she wanted. Perhaps. Or perhaps she wanted someone who understood that silence can be a language too. Tessa placed a three-finger hand on David's shoulder. Be careful. Not because she is dangerous, though she is. Be careful because loneliness that deep becomes part of you. When it finally breaks, it can drown everything nearby. David thought about that warning as he made his next trip to the foothills. The dragon was there as always. But today she did something new. She lowered her massive head to the ground, a level with where David Saturday, for the first time, he could see the scars. Dozens of them, hidden beneath her scales. Old wounds that had healed badly. Evidence of a life filled with violence and loss. David slowly reached into his pack. He pulled out his field journal and opened to a blank page. He was not an artist, but he could sketch basic shapes. He drew the mountain, the dragon on her ridge, himself as a small figure below. He held up the drawing. The dragon stared at it. Then she did something that made David's breath catch. She lifted one massive claw and gently, carefully touched the drawing. Just a tap, an acknowledgement. That night, a storm rolled in from the east. Lightning split the sky. David lay in his bunk and listened to rain hammer against the roof. He thought about the dragon alone on her mountain, weathering the storm as she had weathered thousands before. Some kinds of loneliness were so deep that company almost hurt worse than isolation. But maybe, just maybe, the right kind of presence could make it bearable. The storm lasted 3 days. By the second day, David ignored protocol and headed for the foothills despite the rain and wind. Dr. Walsh tried to stop him, citing safety regulations, but David went anyway. It was the first time he had ever broken a direct order. The path was slick with mud. Rain came down in sheets that made visibility nearly impossible. David pushed forward, driven by something he did not fully understand. Concern, maybe, or recognition that he knew what it felt like to weather storms alone. Lightning cracked overhead as he reached the foothills. The dragon was not on her usual ridge. David wiped rain from his eyes and searched the rocky landscape. Nothing. Then he saw the cave entrance, a dark opening in the mountainside that he had never noticed before. Fresh scratches in the stone suggested recent use. David approached carefully. "Hello," he called into the darkness. His voice was swallowed by thunder. A low rumble answered. Not threatening, almost questioning. David stepped inside. The cave was massive, carved by time or by claws into a space large enough for a dragon. The air was dry and still, a stark contrast to the storm outside. His eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. The dragon sat in the center of the cave, watching him. Water dripped from her scales, pooling on the stone floor. Behind her, deeper in the cave, David could see marks on the walls. Scratches. Patterns. Art. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," David said quietly. Then he felt foolish. Of course she was all right. She had survived 3,000 years of storms, but the dragon made a sound. Low and resonant, it vibrated through David's chest. Not words, just acknowledgement. David set down his pack and pulled out his emergency blanket. Useless for a dragon, but he spread it on the ground and sat down. He would wait out the storm here. With her, hours passed. The storm raged outside while inside the cave. Silence settled like dust. David studied the marks on the walls. They were not random. They told a story. He could see it now. Images of dragons in flight, battles, gatherings, and then fewer and fewer dragons until only one remained. Her story. Her grief. Written on stone because there was no one left to tell. David stood and approached the wall carefully. The dragon watched, but did not move. He reached out and traced one of the carvings with his fingers. A dragon in flight, wings spread wide. They were beautiful, he said softly. The dragon rose. She moved to the wall and placed her claw next to his hand. For a moment, they stood together, touching the same carving, sharing the same memory of something lost. Then the dragon did something unexpected. She walked to a different section of the cave wall, one that was still blank. She raised her claw and began to carve. David watched, as a new image took shape. Small and simple. A figure. Him. When she finished, she looked at him. Waiting, David understood. He pulled out his field knife and approached the wall. Next to his image, he carved another shape. Rough and inexpert, but recognizable. A dragon. They stood together in the cave, their carvings side by side on the stone. Two lonely beings who had found each other by accident and chosen to stay by choice. The storm broke that evening. David made his way back to the outpost in the fading light, soaked and exhausted, but feeling something he had not felt in years. Connection. Dr. Walsh was waiting for him. You could have died out there. I know. What is so important in those foothills that you would risk your life? David met her eyes. Someone who needed to know they were not alone. Walsh studied him for a long moment. She was smart enough to know he was not talking about plant samples. Be careful, David. Whatever you found out there, be careful. The visits continued, but they changed. The dragon began showing David more of her world. She led him to places in the foothills where rare plants grew. Spots where the stone formations created natural music in the wind. A pool of water so clear it looked like glass. She was sharing her home. The place she had protected alone for 3,000 years. David reciprocated by sharing pieces of his own life. He brought his datapad and showed her images of Earth. Oceans, mountains, cities. He showed her recordings of music, of laughter, of the things that made humans human. The dragon absorbed it all with those ancient, intelligent eyes. Sometimes she would make sounds, low rumbles or high chimes that David began to recognize as reactions. Pleasure, curiosity, sometimes sadness. One afternoon, David found her at the pool. She was staring at her reflection in the still water. When she saw him approach, she stepped back. David looked at the reflection. A dragon, massive and scarred and utterly alone. He sat down next to the pool and looked at his own reflection. A human, small and weathered and just as alone. We match, he said quietly. The dragon made a sound that might have been agreement. That night, Oren visited David's quarters. The Kalar scientist seemed agitated, his skin shifting through rapid color changes. Something is coming, Oren said. A ship from the Galactic Coalition. They detected unusual energy readings from Silent Peak. They want to investigate. David's blood went cold. When? 3 days. Maybe 4. David looked out the window toward the mountain, toward the dragon who had finally, after 3,000 years, allowed someone into her world. He had 3 days to figure out how to protect her from a galaxy that would not understand. The Coalition ship arrived early, dropping out of orbit with the kind of confidence that came from having authority. It was a research vessel, sleek and covered in sensor arrays. David watched it land near the outpost and felt his stomach turn. Dr. Walsh called an emergency meeting. The entire research team crowded into the main building along with several Kalar observers. The woman who emerged from the ship introduced herself as Dr. Vesa, senior xenobiologist for the Coalition. She was Kalar, but different from the locals. Her skin held brighter colors, and she wore the kind of clothing that suggested she had never actually worked in a field. Everything about her screamed academic authority. We have been tracking unusual energy signatures from this region, Vesa announced, pulling up holographic displays. The readings suggest a life form of immense age and power, possibly pre-space flight, possibly the last of its species. The local Kalar elders shifted uncomfortably. We know about the dragon, Dr. Walsh said carefully. The local population has an understanding with her. She is left alone. Vesa smiled. It was not a kind smile. An understanding is not a scientific protocol. If this creature is as old as the readings suggest, she represents an invaluable opportunity. Medical data, biological samples, historical information about pre-contact civilizations. David spoke before he could stop himself. She is not a research opportunity. She is a person. Every eye in the room turned to him. Vesa's smile widened. You have encountered the creature? Too late, David realized his mistake. Dr. Walsh shot him a warning look. I have worked in the foothills, David said carefully. I know the area. Then you'll guide my team tomorrow. We need someone familiar with the terrain. It was not a request. That night, David climbed to the foothills despite the darkness. The dragon was waiting, silhouetted against the stars. She knew something was wrong. He could see it in the way she held herself, tense and alert. David sat down in his usual spot. For a long time, neither of them moved. Then he pulled out his datapad and showed her images. Ships, scientists, equipment. He did not know if she understood the specific threat, but he tried to communicate the general idea. People were coming. People who would not respect her silence. The dragon watched the images. Then she stood and walked to the edge of the ridge. She looked down at the distant outpost, at the coalition ship gleaming in the moonlight. When she turned back to David, her eyes held something he had never seen before. Fear, not fear of dying. Dragons did not fear death. Fear of being alone again. Fear of losing the one connection she had found in 3,000 years. David stood and approached her slowly. He reached out and placed his hand on her scaled foreleg. The first time he had ever touched her. I will not let them take you. The dragon lowered her head until her eye was level with his face. They stayed like that for a long moment, understanding passing between them without words. Then she pulled back and disappeared into the darkness of her mountain. The next morning, Vesa assembled her team. 3 scientists for security personnel and enough equipment to study a small moon. David was forced to join them as their guide. They reached the foothills by midday. Vesa immediately began setting up scanning equipment, while her team spread out with collection tools and cameras. Remarkable, Vesa said, studying her readings. The energy signature is stronger here. She must be close. David said nothing. He knew exactly where the dragon was. He could feel her watching from the mountain above. One of the security officers pointed. Movement. There. The dragon emerged from behind a rock formation. She moved slowly, deliberately, placing herself between the team and her mountain. A clear message. No further. Vesa stepped forward, holding some kind of scanning device. Magnificent. She appears even larger than the data suggested. Begin documentation. Cameras activated. Scanners hummed. The security team raised weapons, not to fire, but to be ready. The dragon's eyes found David in the crowd. He saw the question there. The confusion. He had brought these people. He had led them here. David stepped forward, positioning himself between the dragon and Vesa's team. Stop. Excuse me. Vesa looked at him like he had lost his mind. She has not given permission for any of this. She has not agreed to be studied. Permission. Vesa laughed. She is a non-sentient creature. We do not need permission. The dragon made a sound. Low and rumbling, it shook the ground beneath their feet. Several team members stepped back. The security officers raised their weapons higher. She is sentient, David said firmly. She is intelligent, aware, and she is asking you to leave. You cannot possibly know that. Yes, I can, because I've spent 3 months listening to her. The dragon moved closer, not threatening, but protective. She positioned herself directly behind David, a clear declaration. He was hers. They were together. Vesa's expression hardened. I have authorization from the Galactic Coalition to study any unregistered life forms in this sector. You can cooperate, or I can have you removed from this team and sent back to Earth. David met her eyes. Then send me back. I will not help you hurt her. The standoff held for a long moment. Then the dragon did something that changed everything. She opened her mouth and created a sound. Not a roar, not a growl. A song that was haunting and beautiful and filled with 3,000 years of loneliness. Everyone froze. Even Vesa looked shaken. The song ended. Silence fell over the foothills. That, David said quietly, is what you want to put in a laboratory. Vesa recovered quickly. All the more reason to study her. Imagine what we could learn. The dragon's eyes blazed. She spread her wings wide, a display of power and fury. The ground trembled. David knew what was coming. She would attack. She would destroy the equipment, maybe hurt people. And then the coalition would send military forces. It would end badly for everyone that he had to find another way. David raised his hands. Everyone back to the outpost. Now, we have authorization, Vesa started. You have authorization to study an unregistered life form. But if she destroys your equipment and injures your team in self-defense, you will have to explain to the coalition why you provoked an ancient creature instead of attempting diplomatic contact first. Vesa hesitated. David pressed his advantage. Give me 1 day. Let me try actual communication. If I fail, you can proceed with your study. But at least try to do this right. The security team was already backing away. The dragon's display of power had made them nervous. Vesa looked between David and the dragon, calculating risks and benefits. 1 day, she finally said, but I am sending a report to the coalition. If this creature is truly sentient, we need specialists. Diplomats. David nodded. It was the best he could hope for. The team retreated. David stood alone in the foothills with the dragon. She folded her wings, but remained tense, watching the humans disappear toward the outpost. When they were truly alone, David sat down heavily on a rock. His hands were shaking. I am sorry. I did not know they were coming so soon. The dragon moved closer. She settled on the ground next to him, near enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her scales. David pulled out his data pad. He had spent the previous night preparing something, hoping he would not need it. Now, it was his only option. He opened the file and held up the screen. Images appeared. Not of ships or scientists. Images of Earth. But these were different from the ones he had shown before. That he showed her the last northern white rhinoceros, standing alone in a protected reserve. The last Pyrenean ibex, dying in a world that had no place for it. He showed her photographs of extinct species, of animals that had been the last of their kind. I cannot understand what it is like to be you, David said quietly. But I know what it is like to be the last. To carry something that no one else remembers. He switched to different images. The Voyager probe, drifting alone in interstellar space. Astronauts floating in the void. People who had gone so far that no one could follow. I was on a deep space mission. 12 of us. There was an accident. A cascade failure in the life support system. I was in the cargo bay doing repairs when it happened. By the time I got back to the main ship, they were all dead. David had never told anyone this. Not the counselors. Not Dr. Walsh. No one. It took me 6 months to get the ship functional enough to send a distress signal. 6 months alone with the bodies of everyone I knew. When rescue came, they asked me why I did not talk to mission control. Why I did not use the communication system. He looked at the dragon. Because silence was easier than explaining. Easier than having people try to understand something they never could. The dragon made a low sound. Recognition. David stood and approached her slowly. He held up the data pad one more time. The last images were not of Earth or space. They were memories he had pulled from his personal files. His team, smiling, alive. These people are gone. I am the only one who remembers them. The way they laughed. Their habits. Their stories. When I die, they will be truly gone. Erased. He set the data pad down and looked into the dragon's ancient eyes. You are the only one who remembers your people. Your kind. When you are gone, they will be truly erased. That is the weight you carry. I cannot take it from you, but I can witness it. I can acknowledge that it exists. The dragon was still for a long moment. Then she stood and walked to the cave entrance. She looked back at David. Waiting. He followed. Inside the cave, the dragon moved to the wall with the carvings. Her history. Her grief. She placed one claw on a specific image. A gathering of dragons, hundreds of them, flying together. Then she turned to David and made a sound. Different from any she had made before. It started low and rose higher, shifting in tone and pattern. It was language. Not English. Not anything human. But undeniably communication. David listened. He did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. She was telling him about them. About her people. About what they were and what was lost. When she finished, David approached the wall. He placed his hand on the carving of the dragon gathering. They mattered. They existed. And I will remember that you told me about them. The dragon lowered her head until her forehead touched his chest. Gentle. Trusting. They stood like that for a long time. Then David pulled back and met her eyes. The coalition is coming. More ships. More people. I can try to negotiate protection for you, but I need to know what you want. Do you want to be left completely alone? Or would you accept limited contact on your terms? The dragon was silent for a long moment. Then she moved to the blank section of wall where they had carved their images together. She began to carve again. Slow and careful, David watched as new shapes appeared. The dragon, himself, and between them, other figures. Small, careful, controlled. She was saying yes. She would accept contact, but only if David was there. Only if it was on her terms. I can work with that, David said. That night, he returned to the outpost and requested a meeting with Vesa. Dr. Walsh and the Kalar elders joined them. She is willing to allow limited contact, David announced, but only under specific conditions. No weapons, no forced studies, small groups only, and all contact goes through a designated liaison. Who? Vesa asked. Me. Vesa shook her head. The coalition will never agree to one person controlling access to a discovery this significant. Elder Tessa spoke up. Then the coalition will get nothing. The dragon has chosen. We Kalar will support her choice. This is our world. Our rules. David looked at Vesa. You have two options. Accept these terms or spend years fighting for access while learning nothing. Choose. Vesa was silent for a long moment. Then she nodded. I will send a proposal to the coalition. But this is not over. David smiled. No, it is just beginning. 3 months after the coalition agreed to David's terms, the first official contact session took place. 2 scientists. No weapons. No invasive equipment. Just observation tools and respectful distance. David led them to the foothills where the dragon waited. She was nervous. David could see it in the way she held her wings slightly raised, ready to flee or fight. But she stayed. She had promised to try. The scientists were a Kalar named Hess and a human woman named Rachel Foster. Both had been carefully selected. Both had read David's extensive report on proper conduct. Remember, David said quietly, no sudden movements, no loud noises. If she moves away, we do not follow. This is her space. We are guests. Rachel nodded. Her eyes were wide as she took in the dragon's size. She is incredible. The dragon made a low sound. Not threatening, almost curious. They spent 2 hours in the foothills. The scientists took readings from a distance, made observations, asked David quiet questions about the dragon's behavior. The dragon watched them, occasionally moving closer to investigate these new humans. When the session ended, Rachel approached David. Thank you. That was the most remarkable experience of my career. Good. Tell the coalition. Tell them this is how it should be done. Word spread. More requests came in. Biologists, historians, even artists who wanted to paint her. David reviewed each request carefully. Some he approved. Most he rejected. The dragon began to relax. She learned that these controlled visits did not threaten her sanctuary. That David would never allow anyone to harm her. Trust grew. One day, Elder Tessa visited the foothills with David. She moved slowly, her ancient body struggling with the rocky terrain. But she insisted on coming. The dragon emerged and studied the old Kalar. Tessa bowed low, a gesture of deep respect. 3,000 years, Tessa said softly. 3,000 years you have been alone. I am glad you are alone no longer. The dragon made a sound like wind chimes. Gentle, accepting, Tessa turned to David. Our people failed her. We thought leaving her alone was kindness. But sometimes the greatest cruelty is abandonment disguised as respect. David understood. He'd spent years after his team died, being left alone because people thought that was what he needed, what he wanted. But loneliness and solitude were not the same thing. We all did the best we could with what we understood, David said. The coalition eventually sent a diplomat, a severe man named Director Chun, who wanted to formalize the arrangement. Papers were signed. Protocols were established. The dragon was granted protected status. Her mountain became a sanctuary that could only be visited with explicit permission. David was appointed official liaison, a position that came with a salary and a permanent posting to Verdant 7. He accepted immediately. The research outpost expanded, not into a massive station, but into a proper facility. More scientists came to study the unique ecosystem of the foothills. The Kalar benefited from increased trade and attention. Everyone won. But the real change was smaller and more personal. David no longer spent every day in the foothills. He did not need to. The dragon would sometimes come to him, gliding down from her mountain to land near the outpost. The first time it happened, everyone panicked. But she just wanted to see where David lived when he was not with her. She became part of the community. Not tame, never that, but accepted and accepting. Point one evening, 6 months after the coalition agreement, David sat in the foothills watching the sunset. The dragon settled beside him, close enough that he could lean against her foreleg. "I've been thinking," David said, "about names. The Kalar say your kind did not use them. But would you want one? Something others could call you?" The dragon made a considering sound. "You do not have to decide now, or ever. Just a thought." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned purple and gold. Two beings who had been alone so long they forgot what connection felt like. David pulled out his datapad and showed her new images. His team, the people who died. "I talk about them now. To Dr. Walsh, to some of the other researchers. It helps, remembering out loud." The dragon touched the screen gently with one claw. "An acknowledgement. Maybe you could tell me more about your people. Not today, but someday. I could record it, translate it, make sure their story does not disappear." The dragon looked at him with those ancient eyes. Then she nodded, slow and deliberate. "Good." A ship passed overhead, leaving a bright trail across the darkening sky. David watched it go. Once, he would have felt the urge to be on it, to keep moving, to avoid staying anywhere long enough to form connections that could be lost. Now, he felt only contentment. "I was thinking of staying," David said quietly. "Permanently, making this my home, if that is acceptable to you." The dragon made a sound that vibrated through his entire body. Not words, but David had learned to read her tones. This one meant yes. Yes, stay. Yes, home. They sat together as the stars emerged. The last human from a doomed mission and the last dragon of a dead civilization. Both broken, both healing, both learning that being the last of something did not mean being alone. In the distance, lights from the outpost glowed warm against the darkness. Voices carried on the wind. Laughter. Life. The dragon began to hum, low and resonant. The first time David had heard her make that particular sound. It took him a moment to realize what it was. Contentment. He leaned back against her scales and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, the silence did not feel heavy. It felt like peace. The dragon had been alone for 3,000 years. But she was alone no longer. Neither was David. And that made all the difference.